They called it cursed, the ruin on the hill, and for that reason, no one in the valley would go near it. But Eleanor Frost, at 21 years of age, found herself with little choice and even less coin. She was cast out with no family, no prospects, and only the clothes she wore, a single trunk, and the £50 meant to erase her existence. She spent 20 of those pounds on the deed to a pile of stones and shadows named St. Tegan's Abbey, a place whispered to be sour ground. What nobody knew, what Eleanor herself could not yet imagine, was that sealed behind the Abbey's ancient ivy-choked gatehouse was not a curse, but a trust left to wait, a key that would unlock not just a forgotten history, but the door to her own life. This is the story of how she found it. Settle in, and let us tell you how a rejected stone became the cornerstone. Eleanor's life had been one of quiet observation, lived in the spaces others left empty. Her mother, a gentle woman with a love for pressed flowers and poetry, had faded from the world when Eleanor was only 6, leaving behind a small silver locket and a silence that filled their tall London house. Her father, a scholar lost in the labyrinth of his books, was a kind but distant presence. He provided for her needs with the same absent-minded generosity he gave to his research assistants. But the true running of the house and of Eleanor's upbringing fell to others. When he remarried 2 years later, his new wife, a widow with 2 boisterous sons of her own, saw Eleanor not as a daughter to be loved, but as a fixture to be managed, another piece of furniture that had come with the house. It was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, who truly raised her. Mrs. Gable was a woman forged from practicality and loss, a widow herself who had buried her own daughter years before. She saw in Eleanor a similar solitude and a sharp, hungry mind. She taught the girl not the fine arts of watercolor or pianoforte, but the enduring arts of survival. Under Mrs. Gable's tutelage, Eleanor learned to keep accounts, to balance a ledger to the last halfpenny. She learned to tell good linen from poor, how to turn a collar, and how to patch a sheet so finely the mend was nearly invisible. She learned the language of the garden, the needs of herbs, the rotation of vegetables, the patient work of compost and mulch. She learned to mix whitewash, to repair a sash cord, and to tell by the sound of a floorboard if the joist beneath was sound. Mrs. Gable spoke little of affection, but she gave Eleanor the far greater gift of competence. "A woman with skills is never truly destitute, child," she would say, her hands busy kneading dough or polishing silver. "They can take your home, but they cannot take what is in your head and in your hands." Eleanor held on to these lessons as she held on to the small, worn locket from her mother, a cool, constant weight against her skin. It was the only object that was truly hers, a tangible link to a love that had existed before the ledgers and the carefully managed household accounts. She grew up observant, quiet, and self-reliant, a ghost in her own home, useful but unseen, her worth measured in the tasks she completed and the trouble she did not cause. The trouble, it turned out, was her very existence. When her father passed away after a short, sharp illness, the precarious balance of her life collapsed. For 6 months, a suffocating quiet descended upon the house, a period of formal mourning that felt no different from the years that had preceded it. Eleanor continued her duties, managing the household accounts for her stepmother, ensuring the tradesmen were paid, the larder stocked, the machinery of the home running smoothly. Her stepmother accepted this work without comment, her silence a heavy, watchful thing. Then, on a gray Tuesday in April, a letter arrived from the family solicitor, requesting Eleanor's presence. She went alone, wearing her best gray dress, the one she had sewn herself. The solicitor's office was a place of old leather and dry, rustling paper. Mr. Davies, a man who had known her father for 20 years, did not meet her eye. He cleared his throat and spoke of her father's great wisdom and foresight. He then unrolled the will. The estate, the London house, the investments, all of it was left to his wife, to be passed to her sons upon her death. Eleanor's name appeared only once, in a brief codicil. "To my daughter, Eleanor Frost," Mr. Davies read in a dry monotone, "I bequeath the sum of £50 as a final settlement and in recognition of her independent nature." Independent nature. The words were a carefully chosen cruelty, a dismissal disguised as a compliment. £50 to erase 21 years. Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. There was no shock, only the quiet click of a final lock turning. She looked at her stepmother, who had insisted on being present, and saw a flicker of cold triumph in her eyes. It was not hatred, it was something far more chilling, the dispassionate satisfaction of a problem solved. Eleanor did not cry. She did not argue or plead. The lessons of Mrs. Gable had built a spine of iron within her. She simply nodded. "I see," she said, her voice even. She signed the receipt for the bank draft, her signature clear and steady. She walked out of the office, the £50 in her purse, feeling both impossibly heavy and insultingly light. She returned to the house that was no longer her home and went to her room. She packed a single, sturdy trunk. In went her few plain dresses, her sewing box, a gift from Mrs. Gable, her books on botany and household management, and the small, leather-bound ledger in which she had practiced her bookkeeping. Lastly, she tucked her mother's locket safely into a pocket. She did not take the silver-backed brush from her dressing table or the cashmere shawl her father had given her one Christmas. They belonged to the house, not to her. Within an hour she was done. She arranged for the trunk to be sent to the coaching inn at Charing Cross and walked out of the front door, closing it softly behind her. She did not look back. The journey was a long unwinding, a stripping away of all she had known. She traveled west, away from the smoke and clamor of London, seated inside a series of increasingly Spartan coaches. The first leg of the journey was cushioned, the sway of the carriage a familiar rhythm. But as the miles passed, the roads grew rougher, the inns more rustic, the company more coarse. She was a solitary figure in gray, her face turned to the window, watching the landscape transform. The neat, manicured fields of the home counties gave way to the rolling hills and dense woodlands of the Midlands, and then, after days of travel, to something else entirely. As the coach crossed the border into Wales, the world seemed to change its very bones. The hills grew into mountains, their shoulders cloaked in mist, their slopes a patchwork of green and slate gray. The tidy brick farmhouses were replaced by cottages of rough-hewn stone that seemed to grow directly from the earth. The air itself felt different, cleaner, laced with the damp scent of moss and rain and the faint, briny tang of a distant sea. The people changed too. The soft, rounded vowels of English were replaced by the musical, guttural sounds of Welsh, a language she did not understand but which resonated with the ancient landscape. She saw hardship in the faces of the farmers and quarrymen she passed, but also a deep, unyielding strength. Eleanor ate bread and cheese she bought from village shops, and she drank water from her own flask, hoarding her small store of money with the meticulous care Mrs. Gable had taught her. At night, she took rooms in the quietest, cheapest inns she could find, her trunk a solid, reassuring presence at the foot of her bed. She was utterly alone, a ship cut loose from its moorings, yet she did not feel despair. Instead, a quiet watchfulness took its place. She was no longer a daughter or a stepdaughter, a dependent or a manager. She was simply a woman, moving through the world on her own terms. She felt a strange sense of expansion, as if the tight confines of her previous life had been a corset she had only just unlaced. The fatigue of the journey settled deep in her bones, but with it came a clarity she had never known. She was an observer, cataloging the details of this new world. The way the stone walls were built without mortar, the sharp, pecking cry of the red kites circling overhead, the deep green of the ferns that grew in every damp crevice. She was becoming a part of this landscape, or perhaps it was becoming a part of her. Her journey ended in Llanfair y Moch, a small village nestled in a green valley, a place whose name she had found by chance on a map in her father's atlas, chosen for its remoteness, for the simple fact that it was as far from London as her money would take her. The village was little more than a single street, a cluster of stone cottages, a public house, a chapel, and a smithy, all huddled together as if for warmth against the looming mountains. The local people were reserved but not unkind, their curiosity about the strange Englishwoman tempered by a polite reticence. She took a room above the public house, the Red Dragon, and began to listen. It was there, sitting by the fire with a cup of tea, that she first heard of St. Tegan's Abbey. The men spoke of it in low voices, a place to be avoided, a ruin since the time of the old kings, they said. The ground was soured by the bitterness of the monks who had been driven out. They spoke of lights seen in the empty windows, of a ghostly chant heard on the wind, of livestock that sickened if they strayed too close to its crumbling walls. It was cursed, they all agreed. The property, which included the ruined Abbey church, a cloister and an acre of overgrown land, belonged to the local squire, Mr. Price, who had been trying to rid himself of it for years. It was a blight on the county books, and he would sell it for a song to anyone foolish enough to take it. The price, one of the men scoffed, was £20, a fortune for a pile of cursed stones. While the others heard a warning, Eleanor heard an opportunity. £20, she had 30 left. She saw not ghosts but walls, not a curse but a roof however broken. She saw stone, timber, and land. She saw a place. The next morning, she presented herself at the office of Mr. Price's solicitor, a Mr. Evans, in the nearby market town. The office was small and smelled of damp wool and old paper. Mr. Evans, a portly man with a perpetually surprised expression, listened to her request with disbelief. He warned her of the Abbey's reputation, its advanced state of decay, the lack of any sanitation or clean water. "It is a ruin, Miss Frost," he said, leaning forward, "fit only for owls and ivy." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "I am aware of its condition," she said calmly. "I wish to purchase it." Defeated by her quiet determination, he drew up the papers. An hour later, Eleanor Frost, spinster, aged 21, was the owner of St. Tegan's Abbey. She walked the 2 miles from the village, the deed a stiff roll in her hand. The abbey stood on a low hill, commanding the valley. The gatehouse was the most intact part, a squat, 2-story structure of grey stone. Beyond it, the abbey itself was a skeleton, its great arches open to the sky, its walls a tapestry of thick, grasping ivy. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and centuries of decay. But Eleanor looked past the ruin. She saw the solid, 3-foot-thick walls of the gatehouse. She saw a chimney stack that, while crooked, was still standing. In the cobbled courtyard, half buried under weeds, she found the stone-lined rim of a well. It was broken, but it was there. She stood in the doorway of the gatehouse, a place no villager had entered for 100 years, and felt not fear, but the first, faint stirring of something she had never dared to feel before. Hope. The work of reclamation began not with grand gestures, but with a broom. For the first week, Eleanor lived in her room at the Red Dragon, walking to the Abbey each morning at dawn and returning at dusk, covered in dust and grime. She started with the gatehouse, the only part of the structure that offered any promise of shelter. The ground floor was a single large room thick with the debris of ages, fallen plaster, rotted timbers, layers of leaf mold, and the nests of birds and mice. She swept and shoveled, her body aching with the unaccustomed labor. She filled wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow, alone from the bemused but kindly village blacksmith, and tipped the contents onto a growing pile in the courtyard, a future compost heap. Slowly, painstakingly, the stone flag floor was revealed. It was uneven and cracked in places, but it was solid. She scrubbed it clean, with water hauled in buckets from the village pump, her knuckles raw, her back a knot of pain. But with each cleared space, each patch of clean stone, the gatehouse felt less like a ruin and more like a room. It was during this cleaning, as she was sweeping the last corner of the main room, that she noticed it. The floor here was not made of the same dark, ancient flagstones as the rest. In a 10 by 10-foot section against the far wall, the floor was made of thick, well-fitted oak boards, dark with age but clearly a later addition. Curious, she knelt and knocked her knuckles against them. Instead of the dull thud of wood on earth, she heard a faint, distinct echo, a hollow sound. Her heart, for the first time in days, beat a little faster, Mrs. Gable's voice echoed in her memory. Always look for what is out of place. The next day, she returned with a crowbar, another loan from the blacksmith, who had begun to look at her with a sort of grudging respect. Finding a purchase at the edge of one of the boards, she put her weight into the bar. The old nails groaned in protest, then pulled free with a screech of rusty metal. She lifted the board, then another, and another, her breath held tight in her chest. Beneath them was not a shallow cellar or a rat's nest, but a void. A small, stone-lined chamber, perfectly dry, its air still and cold. And in the chamber, shrouded in darkness, sat 3 heavy iron-bound oak chests and, resting atop the largest one, a thick leather-bound ledger, and a smaller vellum packet sealed with dark brittle wax. With trembling hands, she lit a lantern. The chests were far too heavy to move, but their locks were simple, and the crowbar made short work of them. She lifted the first lid. The lantern light flashed and glittered on a sight she could not comprehend. A mound of silver coins, tarnished but unmistakable. The second chest held gold, sovereigns, goblets, chalices, and plates, intricately worked and breathtakingly beautiful. The third held yet more, a king's ransom of precious metal and jewels. She sank back on her heels, the scale of it overwhelming. Finally, she turned to the books. The large ledger was filled with dense, spidery script, lists of names and places and sums. It was an account book. It was the smaller packet, however, that drew her. She broke the fragile seal. Inside was a single sheet of vellum, folded twice. The writing was in Latin, but it was a clear, scholarly hand she could read thanks to her father's forgotten lessons. It was a letter, dated 1538. It was from a man named Brother Thomas, the last abbot of St. Tegan's. He wrote of the coming of the king's men, of the dissolution of the great houses of faith. Unwilling to see the abbey's wealth, accumulated over 500 years for the glory of God and the good of the valley, fall into the hands of greedy courtiers, he and his brothers had made a pact. They had hidden it all, along with their most precious records, in this secret place. The large ledger, he explained, contained the abbey's charters and deeds. It proved that the abbey, not the crown, held title to all the surrounding farms and cottages. The rents from those lands belonged, in perpetuity, to the abbot of St. Tegan's, or, he wrote, to the faithful keeper of this trust, whosoever they may be, who finds this place in a time of need. He ended with a simple prayer that the treasure would be used to restore a place of peace and purpose to the valley. At the bottom of the chest, beneath where the letter had lain, was a small object, a carved wooden bird. Its form simple, its surface worn smooth by the touch of a hand long turned to dust. Eleanor picked it up. It felt warm, alive. She was no longer just the owner of a ruin. She was the keeper of a trust. Eleanor did not rush to the village and declare herself a queen. The instinct for caution, for quiet competence, was too deeply ingrained. She replaced the floorboards over the hidden chamber, the secret a warm, solid weight in the center of her new home. Her first act was not one of proclamation, but of practicality. She took a single gold sovereign from the chest, a coin that felt heavy with history, and walked to the market town. There, she found a reputable assayer, who after a moment of stunned silence at the coin's age and purity, gave her a fair price in modern currency. With this money, she did not buy silks or fine furniture. She bought tools, lime, sand, and timber. And then she went to find Dafydd the mason. Dafydd was a man as old and weathered as the stones he worked, his hands gnarled but impossibly strong. He was the keeper of the old ways, the man who knew how to mix lime mortar that could breathe, who understood the language of the local slate. He had watched her labors from afar, with a silent, critical eye. When she approached him in the village square and asked him to repair the gatehouse chimney, he simply grunted and said, "Be there tomorrow." He arrived at dawn, his tools in a canvas roll. He spent the first hour in silence, walking the perimeter, tapping stones, examining the crumbling mortar. Eleanor worked alongside him, not speaking, simply being present, mixing the mortar to his exact, gruff specifications, hauling buckets of water from the now cleared well. He tested her, asking for tools by names she didn't know, but she watched his hands, anticipated his needs, and learned. By the end of the first day, as he expertly seated the final chimney pot, a grudging respect had formed between them. He accepted her payment, fair wages, paid promptly, with a nod. "The roof next," was all he said before leaving. That evening, as Eleanor sat eating a cold meal of bread and an apple, a knock came at the gatehouse door. It was Gwyneth, the blacksmith's wife, a woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron. She held out a steaming bowl. "You'll catch your death, girl," she said, her Welsh accent thick and warm. "A body needs a hot meal." It was a call, a thick, fragrant Welsh stew of lamb and vegetables. It was the first hot meal Eleanor had eaten in a week, and the first act of simple, unasked-for kindness she had received in years. She ate it slowly, the warmth spreading through her. The community was beginning to coalesce around her, drawn not by her title or her wealth, which they knew nothing of, but by the sight of her patient, unceasing work. Yuan, a young carpenter with dreams of going to America, was hired to repair the roof and window frames. He was astonished to find she knew the difference between seasoned and green oak and could discuss the merits of a mortise and tenon joint. One by one they came, each contributing a skill, drawn by the promise of fair work and the quiet dignity of the woman who was breathing life back into the cursed Abbey. Finally, when the gatehouse was sound and dry, its windows glazed and its chimney drawing sweet, she knew it was time. She wrapped the abbot's letter and the heavy ledger in oilcloth and walked to the office of Mr. Riss, the village solicitor. He was an elderly man, nearing retirement, with a reputation for caution and scrupulous honesty. He listened to her story, his expression shifting from polite interest to skepticism, and finally, to wide-eyed astonishment, as she unrolled the vellum and opened the ancient ledger on his desk. He read the abbot's letter, his lips moving silently. He spent an hour poring over the deeds and rent rolls, cross-referencing them with his own knowledge of the valley's families and properties. At last, he looked up, his old eyes gleaming with a fire she hadn't seen before. "My dear Miss Frost," he said, his voice trembling with excitement, "if this is what I believe it is, this changes everything." The weeks that followed were a quiet storm of legal activity. Mr. Rees, energized by the most significant case of his long career, worked with a diligence that belied his years. He dispatched carefully worded letters to legal scholars in Cardiff and antiquarians in London, sending transcribed copies of the key documents, but keeping the originals locked securely in his safe. The replies trickled back, each one confirming his initial assessment. The claim was not just plausible, it was ironclad. The dissolution of the monasteries had been a chaotic and often poorly documented affair. While the Crown had seized the Abbey itself, the transfer of the Abbey's extensive landholdings had never been legally perfected. The Price family, who had been installed as stewards by a minor Tudor official, had simply assumed the rights of ownership over the centuries, their claim solidified by custom rather than law. But the original title, vested in the Abbey of St. Tegan, had never been extinguished. As the legal owner of the Abbey property, and as the holder of its original, authenticated deeds, Eleanor Frost was the indisputable successor in title. She was, in the eyes of the law, the the rightful recipient of the rents from half the farms and cottages in the valley. A meeting was convened in the village hall. Squire Price, a florid, arrogant man who had until now regarded Eleanor as a mild eccentricity, attended with his own London solicitor, confident of his position. The entire village seemed to be there, packing the small hall, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Mr. Rees, calm and methodical, laid out the case. He presented the deeds, the charters, the unbroken chain of title recorded in Brother Thomas's ledger. He presented the expert opinions from Cardiff. The London solicitor blustered and objected, but the evidence was overwhelming. The color drained from Squire Price's face as the reality of his position became clear. He was not a lord of the manor. He was the descendant of an overreaching functionary, and he had been collecting rents that were not his to collect. A low murmur went through the crowd. In that moment, Eleanor could have ruined him. She could have demanded the back payment of decades of rent, a sum that would have beggared him and his family. The power was hers. But she thought of Brother Thomas's letter, of his hope for a place of peace and purpose. She stood, and a hush fell over the room. "I do not seek to punish the past," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the hall. "I will not be demanding any back rents." A collective sigh of relief went through the assembled tenants. "Going forward," she continued, "the rents will be owed to the Abbey Trust, as they always should have been, and they will be set at a rate 1/4 less than they are today." A stunned silence, followed by an eruption of cheering and stamping feet. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy and compassion. In a single sentence, she had secured her legal rights, established her authority, and won the fierce loyalty of the people of the valley. The curse of St. Tegan's Abbey was broken, replaced by the legend of the quiet Englishwoman who had unearthed a hidden justice. She was no longer an outsider. The gatehouse was no longer just her shelter. It was the heart of the estate. The small rituals of belonging began to form. Gwyneth made a habit of bringing a hot scone or a jug of milk on her way back from the market. Dafydd would stop by to inspect his stonework, staying for a cup of tea and sharing the news of the valley. Yuan the carpenter built her a set of sturdy bookshelves. They knew her name. She was Miss Frost, the new lady of the Abbey, a title she bore not with arrogance, but with a quiet sense of responsibility. 2 years passed, turning the seasons in the valley from the vibrant green of spring to the stark white of winter. It is a soft autumn evening, and Eleanor stands in the doorway of the restored gatehouse. The air is cool and smells of wood smoke from her own chimney and the sweet, damp decay of fallen leaves. The gatehouse is no longer a shell but a home, warm and alive. The main room is simply furnished with pieces made by Yuan the carpenter and purchased from the local market. A sturdy trestle table, a few ladder-back chairs, a comfortable armchair by the fire. The walls are newly plastered and whitewashed, the deep-set windows gleam, and the stone floor is covered with warm woolen rugs woven in the village. A fire of apple wood crackles in the hearth that Dafydd the mason rebuilt, its stones now solid and true. On the mantelpiece, a simple shelf of dark Welsh oak, sit 2 small objects side by side. One is the silver locket her mother gave her, its surface polished to a soft gleam, holding its secret of a single pressed flower. Next to it rests a small carved wooden bird, its lines simple and elegant, its surface worn smooth by the anxious, hopeful hand of a monk who lived 400 years ago. 2 small talismans, left by 2 people who had prepared a way for a future they would never see. Eleanor looks out over the valley, the last rays of sun turning the river to a ribbon of gold. Her life is here now, woven into the fabric of this place. Her days are filled with purpose. She manages the Abbey estate, not as a landlord but as a steward, just as Brother Thomas had prayed his successor would. The great ledger sits on a desk in the corner, its pages now filled with her own neat, clear script. The rents, fairly assessed and diligently collected, are used to benefit the valley. A new roof for the chapel, a small lending library for the village children, a fund to help tenants who fall on hard times. She is learning Welsh, her accent clumsy, but her efforts appreciated. She is a respected presence at the parish council, her opinions listened to with a quiet attention that has nothing to do with her title and everything to do with her proven wisdom. She thinks, sometimes, of her old life, of the cold solicitor's office and her stepmother's triumphant, dismissive gaze. There is no bitterness now, only a distant, quiet pity for a life so small it could only be measured in what it could acquire and discard. She thinks of Mrs. Gable, and a pang of sorrow touches her that she cannot show the old housekeeper what has become of her lessons. The bookkeeping, the gardening, the mending, they were not just skills for survival. They were the tools of creation, the very grammar of this new life she has built. She runs a hand along the cool, ancient stone of the doorframe. She was 21 when she arrived here, a girl with 50 pounds and a single trunk. She spent 20 of those pounds on a pile of cursed and forgotten stones. It was the best 20 pounds she ever spent. It had bought her more than a ruin. It had bought her a home. It had bought her a purpose. It had bought her herself. And as the evening star appears over the dark shoulder of the mountain, a deep peace settles in her heart, a peace as solid and enduring as the ancient stones around her. This is where her story settles, in the quiet rhythm of a life rebuilt from fragments. The great treasury in the stone-lined chamber remains her secret, a deep well of security she draws from, only for the good of the valley, for the mending of roofs and the establishment of small, necessary things. She is not a grand lady in a great house, but something far more rare, a woman content in her purpose, rooted in her place. The Abbey grounds are no longer a place of fear. The cloister walk, once choked with briars, is now a flourishing kitchen garden, its beds laid out with the geometric precision Mrs. Gable would have approved of. Villagers now walk the paths on Sunday afternoons, and the sound of children's laughter sometimes echoes among the great, silent arches of the ruined church. Eleanor has found that the truest wealth was not the gold and silver in the chests, but the trust placed in her hands across 4 centuries. She is the keeper of the Abbey, and in turn, the Abbey has kept her. Her story became a quiet legend in the valley, a testament to the idea that some curses are merely blessings in disguise, waiting for the right person to turn the key. And as we leave her there, standing in the twilight, a figure of quiet strength against the enduring stone, one must wonder, what forgotten door, what sealed-up room, what dusty ledger lies waiting in the overlooked corners of our own lives? What trust have we been given that we have not yet discovered? What ruin is waiting patiently for us to come and call it home?